What's up everyone, as always I hope you're doing great. Today we will talk about the Cordyceps brain infection from the successful video game and TV series The Last of Us. In this video we will analyze from a pathophysiological point of view how this fungus attacks and modifies the human body, the signs and symptoms of the disease it causes, and how realistic the premise of this pathogen is. But first, as usual, let's get some context. For those who are not familiar with this franchise, The Last of Us is a survival horror video game series in which human civilization has collapsed due to an affliction known as Cordyceps brain infection, a contagious disease that turns its victims into violent and grotesque monsters that live only to infect other people. So far, nothing unusual. However, what sets this work of fiction apart from the rest is, on the one hand, its story and emphasis on the relationships between characters, and on the other hand, the fact that the pathogen responsible for the events of the plot is not a virus, as is usually the case, but a fungus, the class of microorganisms that most rarely attack our species. Of the almost 1.5 million species of fungi that are thought to exist, barely 150 cause disease in humans, and of these 150, the vast majority either affect people with a compromised or dysfunctional immune system or produce superficial infections that attack the skin. Fungi, in general, are ill-prepared to attack mammals, but they are prolific pathogens and are extremely dangerous to other classes of organisms such as plants, amphibians, and particularly important in this case, insects and other arthropods. Different classes of fungi known as entomopathogenic fungi have evolved specifically to parasitize these small animals, using their tissues to feed, grow, and reproduce while carrying out one of the most complex and impressive feats a pathogen can accomplish: infect the nervous system of its victims to manipulate them, enslaving them and forcing them to adopt certain behaviors that further spread the disease. Among the parasitic fungi species capable of manipulating their victims, the most well-known and probably the most horrifying are those classified under the name Cordyceps unilateralis sensulato. This last part, sensulato, means in a broad sense, as the scientific name designates a whole set of different species, each one adapted to attack a specific arthropod, although the prototypical victims are ants. Cordyceps unilateralis is precisely the pathogen that serves as the basis for the Cordyceps brain infection that raised the world in The Last of Us. So if we want to understand how the pathogen from this video game saga works, we must first understand how its real-life counterpart works. That said, Cordyceps unilateralis enters the body of the ant by degrading its exoskeleton through the use of enzymes that, combined with an appressorium, help the fungus gain access to the underlying tissues. An appressorium, by the way, is a specialized structure designed for generating pressure unique to fungi, and it's commonly used by these organisms to penetrate deeper into the substrate they inhabit, be it dead or living. Once it has penetrated the exoskeleton and has access to the interior of its victim, this fungus proceeds to secrete a wide variety of substances that we can separate into two main groups. On the one hand, we have polyketides that are responsible for suppressing and altering the ant's immune system, preventing it from responding to the infection. At the same time, some of these polyketides also function as powerful antibiotics and antimicrobials, keeping other microorganisms such as bacteria or other species of fungi from contaminating the ant affected by Cordyceps. In this way, this parasitic fungus leaves its victims defenseless, while also prevents other pathogens from taking advantage of this defenselessness. These polyketides make Cordyceps unilateralis a potential source of very useful drugs and medications. Antibiotics that save millions of lives every year, such as macrolides, including erythromycin or azithromycin, are in fact polyketides, as is the case with tetracyclines. All of these useful compounds are related to those produced by Cordyceps unilateralis. However, among the substances produced by this fungus, the most impressive are probably the indolamines, psychoactive compounds that can mimic certain neurotransmitters from our body. In fact, 5-hydroxytryptamine, better known as serotonin, is also an indolamine, one that is produced by our bodies and that is essential in regulating our behavior and emotions. But at the same time, these compounds can also act as potent hallucinogens in a similar manner to lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD, dimethyltryptamine or DMT, or other psychedelics such as psilocybin or psilocin, which can work as analogs not only to the ant's neurotransmitters but also our own, which in practice allows this pathogen to control its victims. In the case of ants, these substances first induce convulsions and then lead the ant to search for branches or leaves above the forest floor that have the proper temperature and humidity conditions for the fungus to grow and release its spores. Additionally, Cordyceps unilateralis is is capable of secreting other substances that alter the function of muscle cells, such as paxillin, which in ants induces what is known as the death grip, where through strong muscular contractions the ant closes its mandibles and clings to a leaf, branch, or directly to the substrate to secure a safe place for the fungus to grow. And if this variety of substances is not enough, Cordyceps unilateralis is also capable of secreting a whole variety of mycotoxins. It is not an exaggeration to say that this pathogen is a microscopic drug factory, but in my opinion, the most impressive thing about this microorganism is how it goes from being a parasitic fungus that manipulates its victims to a saprophytic fungus that consumes them after death to reproduce. Cordyceps unilateralis is capable of repressing or expressing certain genes depending on whether it needs to manipulate or degrade its victim's body. During the zombification phase, the genes responsible for producing the fungus digestive enzymes are strongly repressed to prevent degradation of the ant's body, and in contrast, genes that manage the production of indolamines and polyketides are repressed when the ant is dead and the fungus needs to grow. All of this happens in response to certain environmental conditions, which is certainly an interesting and complex behavior. All of these features present in a real-life organism make Cordyceps unilateralis an apparently very plausible candidate for the origin of a zombie apocalypse, which brings us back to The Last of Us. The Cordyceps responsible for the events in this franchise is a mutated version of Cordyceps unilateralis. In this universe, Cordyceps, pressured by global warming and climate change, acquires the ability to infect humans by developing a greater tolerance to warmer temperatures, such as those in our bodies. This mutation occurred in Indonesia in the series, while the game points to South America, Mexico, or Central America as the origin of the pathogen, which then proceeds to spread worldwide, apparently to different crops and food products. Certainly, Cordyceps does not attack plants, so it may not make sense at first, but it should be noted that many insect species are agricultural pests, and insects are also the main prey of this pathogen. Contamination of grain and cereals by various insect species is quite normal and expected, to the point that even in developed countries, the presence of a certain amount of insect parts in, for example, flour is considered safe, so there was little that could be done to prevent the global spread of the disease from the beginning. When spore-laden food reached supermarkets worldwide and began to be consumed, millions or probably hundreds of millions of people were infected, and this brings us to the transmission methods of this disease. Cordyceps brain infection is a disease that is mainly transmitted through the bite of an infected person, but can also be contracted by inhaling a sufficient amount of spores or consuming food contaminated with the fungus. A little detail, though, is that while in the game saliva is directly infectious, in the TV series bites are infective through the direct transmission of the mycelium of the fungus, which is able to protrude through the mouth of the infected, lodging itself in the wound and spreading along the subcutaneous cellular tissue towards the brain. And for this reason, in the TV series, the period between the bite and the disease is clearly influenced by the site of the bite. The closer to the brain, the faster the disease settles, in a similar manner to rabies. Before the infected fully develop the disease, they show a series of non-specific signs and symptoms that are somewhat difficult to identify, a phenomenon called prodromes in medicine. Among the initial signs and symptoms, we have involuntary muscle contractions and speech disturbances that indicate that the fungus is spreading to the victim's motor cortex. At the same time, fatigue, general malaise, and mood and behavior disorders may appear, and this points to the involvement of the limbic system, the part of our nervous system that regulates our emotions and motivations. Beyond this, some documents also indicate the possible presence of other initial symptoms such as vomiting, hyperorexia or excessive hunger, insomnia, and ophthalmodynia or eye pain. And as these symptoms develop and the fungus takes hold of the brain, there is little our immune system can do to defend us, not only because of the immunosuppressive and anti-inflammatory properties of several of the substances produced by this pathogen, but also because of the blood-brain barrier, which interferes with the function of our defensive cells, again similarly to what happens with rabies. This could explain the fact that despite being a brain infection, fever is not reported among the signs and symptoms of the disease. Fever is not only a response from our immune system, but also one of our greatest defenses against fungi. Between 24 and 48 hours after initial exposure, the affected person ends up fully developing the disease, and the series of events previously described with ants is repeated on a human scale. scale. The fungus produces a series of psychoactive substances that emulate the functions of our neurotransmitters. This turns infected people into little more than puppets with the sole intention of spreading the disease through an uncontrollably aggressive behavior that leads them to bite uninfected people. Unlike what happens with other similar pathogens in other works of fiction, those affected by Cordyceps do not decay over the years, or they do so at a very slow pace. As mentioned earlier, this pathogen represses the genes that allow it to produce digestive enzymes, which preserves the body of the victims while also secreting different antibacterial and antifungal substances that protect the affected from other infections and microorganisms. And beyond this, as the mycelium of this fungus spreads more and more through their bodies, the infected undergo a series of anatomical changes that enhance their physical capabilities and even make them more resistant to damage through the development of compacted mycelial plates known as sclerotia, which serves as armor for these creatures. These anatomical modifications can be separated into four main phases. First, we have the runners, who are anatomically identical to human beings, fast, aggressive, and with clear alterations in circulation that result in paleness and tortuous and evident blood vessels. Second, we have stalkers, in which facial architecture and sense of sight begin to fade as the fungus protrudes through the skull, probably in a process that mimics how Cordyceps penetrates the exoskeleton of ants through the use of enzymes and apressoria, only this time it is from the inside. The third phase corresponds to clickers, obviously blind but stronger and sturdier than stalkers. From this phase on, the infected depend on their sense of hearing to navigate through space, emitting the clicks that give these creatures their name. The fourth phase corresponds to bloaters, in which the mycelium has grown to such an extent that it has compacted into sclerotia, turning this form of infected into living tanks. And if the conditions of light, humidity, and temperature are right, the different phases of infected can become gigantic sporocarps that release spores into the environment and can be especially dangerous and infectious when concentrated in enclosed spaces. In a future video, we will analyze in detail the anatomy and pathophysiological mechanisms behind each of these variants. Regarding the level of threat posed by Cordyceps brain infection on the danger scale we use in this channel, Cordyceps falls into the same classification as most zombie infections, a 7, global disruption. Cordyceps obviously did not end humanity, and if anything's clear is that in the post-apocalyptic world of this saga, human beings remain the worst threat you can encounter. On the other hand, the fact that there are people with the potential to develop immunity is a great advantage for the survival of our species, and if we want to be realistic, neither the video game nor the series take into account the existence of antifungals. Humans have a relatively wide range of drugs that are quite effective in treating fungal infections. They have their disadvantages, of course, but it is not like we are defenseless. Still, in my opinion, the Cordyceps brain infection is, at least at first glance, one of the most internally consistent and realistic zombie-like pathogens that exist. Despite being a work of fiction, the mechanisms used by Cordyceps in real life could be applied point by point from insects to humans to create a disease of catastrophic proportions. One might think that we are only a few mutations away from living in a true zombie apocalypse. However, this is far from reality, and in the next video we will analyze why, besides temperature, Cordyceps is incapable of infecting humans and what makes mammals in general so resistant to fungi. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and remember that you can support me on Patreon and follow me on Instagram, where I always announce new content. Don't forget to feed YouTube's algorithm with a comment so it can recommend this video. Goodbye people, and I'll see you in the next one.